Why did his wife invite a plumber, a photographer, and her best friend on the same evening? The morning sun pierced through the heavy bedroom curtains as Jason woke up to a phone call that seemed too alarming for such an early hour. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, its screen flashing an unfamiliar number. He sighed, pressed the answer button, and held the phone to his ear. "Hello?" Jason asked, his voice still groggy and slightly hoarse. There was silence on the other end, only faint breathing audible. He was about to hang up when suddenly, a voice, unfamiliar but faintly recognizable, spoke. "Tonight, everything will become clear." Jason flinched, his heart tightening. The voice was low, calm, but carried an undeniable hint of menace. "Who is this?" he asked, trying to remain composed. "What do you mean?" But there was no response. The line went dead, leaving him deep in thought. For a few seconds, he just sat there, staring at his phone screen, trying to recall who that voice might belong to. It was too familiar to be a stranger's, but not familiar enough to attach a name. "Who was that?" came the voice of Nora, his wife, who was already up and in the kitchen. She stood in the doorway, drying her hands on a towel, looking as if nothing unusual had happened. "Unknown number," Jason replied, trying not to look worried. "Strange thing." Nora tilted her head like a cat intrigued by an unexpected sound. "What did they say?" "Nothing much," Jason lied, unwilling to alarm her. "Probably just a wrong number." She nodded, but a faint glimmer appeared in her eyes, one he hadn't noticed before. He began to doubt whether he should have told her anything. Nora went about her day as if nothing had happened, but there was something peculiar in her demeanor. She kept smiling to herself, as if she knew something Jason didn't. He tried to focus on his morning tasks, but the call lingered in his mind. "What's on the agenda today?" he asked, sitting down at the table with his coffee. Nora, standing by the stove, turned away and answered a bit too casually. "Nothing much. Just planning to tidy up the house a little, maybe give Jules a call." Her voice sounded natural, but Jason noticed her gripping the pot handle a little too tightly. He decided not to press further, though his sense of unease only deepened. Throughout the day, he couldn't shake thoughts of that mysterious call. Why did the voice feel so familiar? And why was Nora acting like she was hiding something? As the evening drew closer, Jason sat in the living room scrolling through news on his phone. Nora walked in with a notepad in her hand. "Do you mind if I order a few things for dinner?" she asked. "Of course not," he replied without looking up. "Are we celebrating something?" "No, just felt like doing something nice," she said with that same enigmatic smile that had been unnerving him all day. She quickly jotted something down in her notepad and disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, Jason heard her on the phone. He didn't intend to eavesdrop, but fragments of her conversation reached him. "Yes, at that time exactly. Everything should be ready. He won't suspect a thing." Jason began to question whether he should find out what was going on. His intuition screamed that something was wrong, but he decided to wait for the evening and discover the truth himself. When Nora finished her call, she returned to him, looking even more pleased than before. "Is something wrong?" she asked, noticing him watching her. "No, everything's fine," he replied, though his voice sounded less than convincing. He knew something was brewing, but he decided not to act impulsively. Nora's behavior was too cryptic, and he figured the best way to uncover the truth was to stay inconspicuous and observe. Jason spent the rest of the day in his office, though he kept an ear out for any sounds in the house. Every step Nora took, every phone call she made, heightened his anxiety. Although he tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, something deep inside told him that tonight would be far from ordinary. Jason had always been someone who sought stability. He was a tall, sturdy man with an open face, brown eyes, and a gentle smile that had once captivated Nora. At 35, he looked older, with a slightly furrowed forehead and dull eyes that revealed the tension of recent years. Jason was an engineer who valued precision and predictability, but deep down, he longed for genuine closeness. It was exactly that connection he had found in Nora once, and what he now feared losing. Nora was his complete opposite. She always stood out in a crowd with her energy and spontaneity. Her blonde hair, cascading in waves over her shoulders, would flow freely in the wind as she spoke about her dreams. Her blue eyes, which once sparkled with love for Jason, now seemed a little cold, as if hiding secrets. Nora was a photographer and lived for art. It was her adventurous spirit and spontaneity that had once won Jason over. When they met 10 years ago, their relationship was a whirlwind of emotions. Jason remembered how they spent an entire night walking along the beach, talking about everything from favorite books to future plans. Nora always spoke about her desire to travel and explore, and he listened, mesmerized by her boldness. They were carefree, young, and seemed invincible against life's challenges. But years passed, and something changed. Jason was the first to notice it. At first, it was little things. She started staying late at work, then more frequently took on additional projects requiring travel. He didn't want to cause conflicts and tried to support her, even if it meant spending nights alone. He prepared dinner, waiting for her, but Nora often called to say she'd be late or didn't call at all, returning home only by morning. "Nora, we hardly see each other," he said one evening when she returned from another trip. "I feel like we're drifting apart." She smiled, but her smile felt strained. "You're exaggerating, Jason. I'm just busy with work." She hugged him, but her embrace felt cool. The lack of warmth from before cut into his heart. Jason tried not to give up. He fought for their relationship, organizing romantic dinners, suggesting vacations together. Nora agreed but was never fully interested. She always found a reason to decline, citing urgent matters or busyness. "I feel like you're avoiding me," he once said directly. Nora looked at him with surprise, as if he had suggested something completely absurd. "Jason, what's wrong with you?" "We're fine. I'm just busy." He wanted to believe her, but her behavior said otherwise. She started spending more time with friends, disappearing more often on trips, and rarely talked to him about her feelings. They used to talk for hours, sharing everything. Now their conversations were superficial, and Nora's eyes carried a kind of detachment. One evening, when she came home after another photo shoot, he asked, "Why don't you tell me about your projects anymore? I always loved hearing about your work." Nora tensed slightly but quickly resumed her usual smile. "It's all the same as always. Nothing exciting." But Jason knew that wasn't true. She used to talk about every photo, every shoot with such enthusiasm that it was captivating. Why was she now withholding details? His concern turned into anxiety when she began disappearing for weekends without explaining where she was going. She claimed she needed time alone or to work on a new project, but Jason knew those were just excuses. He tried talking to her, but every time, he hit a wall of denial. Once, when Nora was preparing for another trip, Jason noticed her luggage looked unusually empty. She claimed she was going on business, but she wasn't taking her camera, which was usually indispensable for her trips. It struck him as odd. "Don't you need your camera?" he asked before her departure. "No, not this time. I'm just helping my friend with some planning. Nothing important." Jason nodded, but his suspicions only grew. He didn't want to think the worst, but her behavior left him restless. Sitting alone in their empty apartment, Jason wondered when their relationship had gone off course. Once inseparable, they now felt like two strangers living under one roof. Jason knew something needed to change, but didn't know where to start. That day, after the mysterious phone call, Jason waited anxiously to see what Nora had planned. Jason sat in the kitchen, studying the grocery list Nora had left on the table. He raised an eyebrow when he noticed that among the usual items like vegetables and bread, there were some highly unusual entries. Expensive cheeses, a bottle of French wine, luxury candles, and even a box of Belgian truffles. It felt more like preparations for a romantic evening than an ordinary shopping trip. "What's this list?" he asked as Nora walked into the kitchen. She froze for a moment, as if caught doing something she shouldn't, but quickly regained her composure. "Oh, it's just for dinner," she said, smiling casually. "I thought we could treat ourselves a little." "Dinner? What's the occasion?" Jason pressed. "Just because," she waved him off. "I decided to set the mood a little." Her answer seemed logical, but something in her tone unsettled him. This wasn't the Nora he used to know. She had always shared her ideas, especially when it came to family plans. Now, she seemed as if she was trying to hide something. "I can help with the shopping," he offered. We could go together. Nora quickly shook her head. No, there's no need. It's women's stuff. You just get in the way, she said with a nervous smile, trying to make her refusal sound casual. Jason frowned but didn't insist. In the end, he decided to give her space. However, his suspicions only deepened. He knew that if he kept asking questions, he might ruin the atmosphere. But the thoughts wouldn't leave his mind. When Nora went to the store, Jason stayed home but decided to do a bit of investigating. He went into their bedroom, trying to figure out if there were any clues about her behavior. He didn't find anything unusual, but he did notice that her laptop was left on. On the screen was an open list of invitations. Jason read a few names, but didn't recognize any of them. Sophia, Annabelle, Michael. Who are these people? He muttered, leaning closer to the screen. Nora had never mentioned planning a party, let alone these names. The pieces of the puzzle began to come together in his mind. Could this be the reason for her recent detachment? But why keep it a secret? Jason decided it would be best to wait and observe what unfolded. If it turned out to be something innocent, he could simply breathe a sigh of relief. But if his suspicions were justified, he needed to be prepared for any outcome. When Nora returned home, she carried several grocery bags. Jason noticed that she had brought fresh flowers, lilies, her favorite. She rarely bought them without a reason. Want some help unpacking the bags? He asked, trying to sound attentive. No, I'll handle it myself, she quickly replied, almost rushing to the kitchen. Jason watched as she nervously unpacked the groceries, hiding something in the top cupboard. Her behavior raised even more questions. He decided not to push her, but couldn't stop his mind from racing with possibilities. Later that evening, as Nora cooked dinner, Jason sat in the living room pretending to watch TV. In reality, he was observing her. She seemed focused, but her eyes kept darting to her phone on the counter. Several times, she checked it, quickly replying to messages. Jason decided to check her phone when she was distracted. When Nora left the kitchen to go upstairs, he quietly approached the table and picked up her phone. He knew it was wrong, but his desire for answers outweighed his moral reservations. He opened her recent messages and found a chat with someone labeled as S. The messages were short but intriguing. Is everything ready? Don't forget the candles, and we'll start at 8. Jason tried to figure out who this could be but found no answers yet. When Nora returned, he quickly put the phone back and pretended nothing had happened. She was smiling, but there was a tension in her eyes. Jason felt the distance between them growing even more. Jason immediately recalled the anonymous phone call that morning, where someone had said something would happen tonight. But nothing had happened. The next day, Nora began bustling around the house early in the morning. She meticulously cleaned, arranged candles, and set the table. Jason sat in a chair, watching her, trying to understand what was going on. He offered to help, but she refused again. Just relax, darling, she said, trying to appear calm. Everything will be ready by evening. Jason felt anger bubbling inside him. He couldn't take the tension anymore and decided he had to get answers that evening. That day, Jason sensed that something was about to happen. The atmosphere in the house was unusually tense, even though Nora acted as if everything was fine. She spent the morning cleaning, decorating the table, and even baking a complicated dessert she had never attempted before. Everything seemed too suspicious, and Jason couldn't shake the feeling that his wife was hiding something. Around 3 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. Jason opened it to find Ron, their plumber, standing there with a large toolbox. "Hi, Mr. Hayes," Ron said, smiling. "I was called to check the pipes." "The pipes?" Jason asked, puzzled. "We don't have any plumbing issues. Your wife said there were. She asked me to check the kitchen and the bathroom." Jason glanced at Nora, who quickly approached the door, clearly trying to salvage the situation. "Oh, yes," she interrupted. "I thought the water was draining slowly. I figured it would be better to check before it becomes a real problem." Jason felt something tighten inside him. He knew for sure there were no plumbing issues, but he didn't argue. Ron entered the house, and Nora quickly showed him where to look for the problem. She was overly eager to appear friendly, and Jason, remaining in the living room, focused intently on every movement she made. While Ron worked in the bathroom, Jason sat at the laptop, trying to keep himself occupied. But he didn't have time to reflect on the situation for long before the doorbell rang again. This time, a young man with a professional camera around his neck stood on the doorstep. "Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm a photographer. I was invited to do a photo shoot for a special project." Jason raised an eyebrow in surprise. He knew for sure that neither he nor Nora had ever mentioned any photo shoots. "Project?" he asked, trying not to show his frustration. "Yes," Jeremy replied, looking a bit confused. "Nora said it was important. Is she here?" Nora appeared at that moment, smiling. "Oh, Jeremy. I'm so glad you came. Come on in." Jason stepped aside to let the photographer pass. His gaze turned piercing, but Nora seemed to pay no attention. She began explaining to Jeremy how to set up the lighting and where he could arrange his equipment. There was something too friendly, almost familiar, in her behavior. Jason felt the tension inside him rise. What was this special project? Why didn't he know about it? And what was really going on in his own house? Soon, Jeremy started setting up his gear, and Ron was still working in the bathroom. Jason tried to hold his composure, but his patience was wearing thin. He decided to stop waiting and approached Nora as she excitedly discussed something with the photographer. "Nora, can I have a minute?" he said, trying to stay calm. She turned to him, a little embarrassed. "Yes, darling, what's up? What's going on here? Why do we have a plumber and a photographer in our house on the same day?" "Oh, it's just a coincidence," she answered, as if it was something completely ordinary. "I thought we could take some nice photos. You know I love surprises." Jason could feel how her words only fueled the fire of his suspicions, but he decided to hold back again. After all, things weren't completely clear yet. Jason knew that everything was fine with the plumbing in the house, but he couldn't understand why all of this was happening. An hour later, the doorbell rang a third time. On the doorstep stood Jules, Nora's best friend. Her appearance surprised Jason even more, as he hadn't heard Nora mention anything about her visit. "Hi, Jason," said Jules, walking in and immediately heading to Nora. "How's everything? Your place looks interesting." She smiled mysteriously and looked at Nora, who seemed noticeably more relaxed after her friend's arrival. "Tonight's going to be interesting," Jules added, nodding. "Am I right in thinking everything's ready?" "Yes," Nora replied briefly, exchanging a quick glance with Jules. Jason felt his heart start beating faster. His suspicions were starting to form a clearer picture, but there were still missing pieces. He decided to speak up. "Could someone finally explain to me what's going on?" he said, looking directly at Nora. "Darling," she said, stepping closer. "It's just a party. Nothing serious. I wanted to make it a surprise for you." Jason looked at her suspiciously but didn't respond. His inner voice screamed that this wasn't the case, but he decided to wait for everything to unfold. Jason couldn't understand why this was happening in his own house without his knowledge, especially with such strange people for him. The rest of the day, Jason spent observing the inexplicable hustle and bustle in the house. Ron kept hammering and banging in the bathroom. Jeremy was photographing Nora in various poses in the kitchen and living room, and Jules was walking around the house as if she were the hostess, throwing sympathetic or mysterious glances at Jason. His irritation grew. It was getting late. Nora, it seemed, was just starting to come alive. She changed into a dress that was far more revealing than Jason was used to seeing her in at home. Jules approached her and whispered something, after which both of them burst into loud laughter. Jeremy was photographing all of this, looking pleased, as if the star of the evening wasn't Nora, but he. Jason could no longer stand the spectacle. He decided to have an honest conversation with Nora. Catching the moment when she was alone in the kitchen, he entered and closed the door behind him. "I think I have a right to know what's going on," he said, not hiding his tension. "There's been some kind of circus going on in the house all day. You invited a plumber for no reason, a photographer for some project, and now Jules is here, as if she's the organizer of all this. What does it all mean, Nora?" Nora looked at him, and for a moment it seemed she would get flustered. But then her face took on a cold, almost condescending expression. "Jason, you're always so boring," she replied, crossing her arms over her chest. "I just wanted a little fun. Is that forbidden too?" Fun, he asked, looking her in the eye. And so you invited strangers into our house without asking me? What kind of fun is this, Nora? She rolled her eyes like a teenager listening to a parent's lecture. You're overreacting. Just relax, Jason. Relax? Jason felt his anger finally breaking through. You're acting like I'm the one who's unnecessary here. What's going on, Nora? Are you hiding something? Nora was silent for just a second, but it was enough for Jason to realize his suspicions were not unfounded. You're such a paranoiac, she finally replied, turning sharply and leaving him alone in the kitchen. Jason stood there for a few minutes, trying to collect his thoughts. His intuition screamed that Nora was up to something, and it was clearly not in his favor. He decided not to jump to conclusions, but to keep his eyes open. Later that evening, the doorbell rang for the 9th, or maybe 10th time. Jason opened the door and saw a young man who looked as though he had arrived at the wrong address. Hi, I'm Mark, he said, smiling. Nora invited me for dinner. That was the last straw. Jason could no longer hide his emotions. Great, come on in, Mark, he said with forced politeness, letting the guest inside. When Mark entered the living room, Jason glanced at Nora, who seemed ready to explode with joy. She immediately rushed over to Mark, hugging him like an old friend. Jason noticed how their exchange of glances was too warm for just acquaintances. He turned back to the kitchen, pulled out his phone, and began discreetly recording everything happening. Jason decided that if this spectacle had a finale, he would be the first to know. Jason returned to the living room, trying to stay calm, but inside he was in turmoil. He watched the guests, trying to make sense of what was happening. Nora laughed at Jules' jokes, who seemed to be the center of attention. Her comments caused waves of laughter, but they sounded ambiguous, even a little provocative. Oh, Ron, you know how it is when everything's leaking and won't stop, Jules said, glancing at the plumber, who just laughed and nodded meaningfully. Oh, yes, Ron replied, but I usually know how to fix these problems quickly. Jason noticed how Nora laughed a little louder than would be natural. Her behavior was becoming more and more uninhibited. She kept looking at Mark, who seemed to be trying to remain unnoticed, but every movement he made screamed of something more than just friendly interaction. Mark subtly touched her hand as he passed her a glass of wine, and Jason didn't miss it. His fist clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. He walked over to the window, pretending to admire the evening view, but in reality, he was listening to everything going on. And you, Jason, seem so quiet today, Jules called out, throwing a sly look at him. Maybe you'll join us? We're having a good time here. Jason turned around and met her gaze. I'm just watching everyone have a good time, he replied with a forced smile. Well, don't be so hard on us. It's just a friendly party, she continued, but her tone suggested something more. Meanwhile, Nora had once again gotten closer to Mark. He leaned toward her and whispered something in her ear, after which she burst into laughter and flirtatiously touched his shoulder. That was the final straw for Jason. He felt his anger building up inside him, but he didn't want to act impulsively just yet. He left for the kitchen under the pretext of getting himself some water and began analyzing the situation. His suspicions grew even stronger when he remembered how he had noticed Nora constantly on her phone and frequently stepping out onto the balcony during conversations. He was sure Nora was hiding something, but how did all this connect to the guests? He decided to return and continue observing. When he came back to the living room, he noticed that the atmosphere had become even more tense. Jules was joking again, but now her words were even more provocative. Nora, you're just shining today, she exclaimed. Someone here clearly knows how to make you happy. Everyone laughed, but Jason noticed how Ron and Mark exchanged glances. The gesture seemed suspicious to him. Mark leaned toward Nora and subtly stroked her shoulder. She briefly pulled away, as if she was about to push him off, but then laughed again, and it seemed too natural to be accidental. Jason decided it was time to stop being silent. He approached the group and sat next to Nora, deliberately placing his hand on the back of her chair. She flinched, but quickly regained her composure. So, how's our party going? He asked, addressing everyone at once. Just wonderful, Jules exclaimed. But Jason, you could relax a bit more. We're all friends here. Glad to hear it, he replied, looking directly at Mark, who clearly looked uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Ron stood up and went to the kitchen. Jason thought he might be about to leave, but instead, he came back with a bottle of wine and poured himself another glass. "Well, Jason," Ron said, "you're definitely up to something. But don't worry, everything's under control." These words struck Jason as particularly strange. What exactly did Ron mean? Was he hinting at something specific? In the meantime, Nora continued to laugh and joke as if nothing was wrong. But Jason noticed how her laughter became strained every time he looked at her. The evening continued, and the tension only grew. Jason knew he needed to somehow diffuse the situation, or at least understand what was going on. But how could he do that without losing face in front of the guests? He decided to wait for a moment when everyone was a little more relaxed, and then act. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that every minute passing was becoming harder for him. The atmosphere in the room had changed. Mark, who was usually quite reserved, now wore a satisfied expression and clearly felt at ease. He was putting on quite a show, joking with everyone, and although most people were laughing, Jason couldn't bring himself to join in. For some unknown reason, everything inside him screamed that something was wrong. The laughter was loud, the music played, and soon the guests began dancing, drinking alcohol. Nora looked especially cheerful. She danced with Ron, her movements light, like a young girl. Jason wasn't sure if it only looked that way from the outside, or if there was something more to it. But the more he watched, the more he felt that his wife had become someone else. While everyone continued to enjoy themselves, Jules suddenly approached Jason and, without asking, took his hand. She looked at him with a smile that suggested nothing good and led him outside. Jason was about to refuse but couldn't. Something inside him told him it would be better to stay in the loop of what was happening. "Why so sad, Jason?" Jules asked when they were outside. Her tone was oddly calm and somewhat mocking. "Why don't you let anyone relax?" Jason didn't know what to say. He watched her, trying to figure out what she wanted. "You know, you've already bored your wife, Nora," Jules continued, her words sharp and cutting. "You're always trying to control her, and she can't be satisfied with you anymore. You don't give her space to rest, to have freedom. She wants a break from you." Jason felt his outrage rising to his throat. He couldn't believe what Jules was saying. It wasn't true. He had always loved Nora and tried to create everything she wanted. But now, with her acting this way, he couldn't understand what had happened. His inner struggle intensified, but he tried to stay calm. "I'm not trying to control her," he said, trying to sound calm. "I just care about her. I want us to be happy together." Jules pressed her lips together and shook her head. "You just don't get it," she said. "You're making her choose between you and her own desires. She can't live like this anymore." Jason felt his heart constrict, but he couldn't say anything more. Instead of replying, he silently nodded. "All right," he said after a pause. "Let's have fun." They returned to the house, and Jason tried to regain his composure, but it was difficult. Every movement felt heavy and unsure. It was like he was outside of time, as if frozen in the moment. His gaze couldn't leave Nora, who was now dancing with Ron. Everyone seemed happy, but Jason couldn't find himself in this cheerful crowd. Nora was laughing, her hand on Ron's shoulder, and he had his arm around her waist. They spun in the dance, and Jason couldn't help but notice how close they had become. Ron didn't seem awkward at all. In fact, his movements were confident, even a bit cocky. Nora looked at him with such an expression on her face that Jason felt as if his soul was being torn apart. She looked at him with a smile, the same carefree, even playful smile that Jason had only ever seen from her in the best moments of their life together. But now she was dancing with Ron, not with him, and it broke his heart. Everyone at the party seemed to agree with it. Everyone except him. He watched as Nora felt free with the others, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was pulling away from him. Jason wanted to approach her and talk, but what could he say? What could he say that wouldn't turn into a scene? He stayed aside, but his heart was racing with anger and pain. Nora and Jules went out to the balcony. They started whispering, and Jason saw it through the window. It was very strange to him, and he couldn't understand what they were talking about. Something in their behavior, the way they whispered, gave him a sense that he might be in some sort of nightmare. But he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He gathered his strength and decided to simply observe how things would unfold. Jason woke up early in the morning, but what he saw didn't remind him of a usual start to the day. His head was pounding from the excessive alcohol, and his heart tightened with the panicked feeling that something terrible had happened. He tried to turn over, but immediately noticed a strange scene. There were things scattered all over the living room and hallway. Socks, both women's and men's underwear, pieces of clothing, lingerie. It was all spread across the floor like chaos after a storm. Jason tried to gather his thoughts, and his gaze immediately stopped on the empty bed. Nora wasn't anywhere to be seen. He got up and went through the rooms, but she wasn't in any of them. Inside, he felt anxiety, the sense that something was very wrong. Though everything was quiet, the silence felt too tense. He walked into the living room and saw Ron and Jules. They looked like they didn't understand what had happened. Plumber Ron was in a t-shirt and shorts, and Jules was in a bathrobe that had slipped off her shoulder. They stared at Jason with confused faces, not understanding why he looked so frightened. "What happened?" Jason asked, trying to pull himself together, though his voice trembled betrayingly. "Where is Nora? And where is Mark? Where is the photographer Jeremy?" Jules just shrugged and looked like she had no idea what he meant. "I don't know," she replied, staring at the floor. "We were all drinking, laughing, and then Jeremy went home, and then we all just relaxed and fell asleep." Jason felt his anger begin to rise inside him. What happened last night? Why did Nora disappear? He tried calling her, but every time he heard only silence on the other end of the line. No sound, no response. "Nora isn't picking up," he shouted, starting to panic. "Where is she? Why can't you tell me what happened?" Ron, who was sitting on the couch and desperately trying to smile in a friendly way, realized that the situation was getting serious. He stood up, realizing that Jason was on the edge. "Listen, Jason," he said. "I don't know what happened. We just, well, we drank, had fun, and things just happened. I don't want to upset you, but you should calm down." Jason wasn't listening to him. All he saw was emptiness and mess. Couldn't these people explain anything to him? How could Nora just leave him without a word, without any warning? His heart was racing, and in his mind, there was only one relentless question. What happened last night? He tried calling Nora again, trying to stay calm, but his hands were trembling. The phone still didn't answer. "Do you know where Mark is?" Jason asked Jules. She shrugged again and said, "No, I don't know. I haven't seen him since last night." Jason couldn't take it anymore. His emotions were starting to spiral out of control. The whole house was in chaos, and he couldn't understand what had happened, how everything had turned into a night that he couldn't explain. "I respect you, Ron, but you can't even tell me where my wife is," Jason said, leaning toward the plumber. Ron flinched and stepped back. "Look for your wife. Don't stop at me." "Sorry, I can't say anything," Ron replied, avoiding eye contact. Jason felt his heart tighten with disappointment. As Jason started walking around the house, searching for clues, his gaze landed on one more thing that caught his attention. A strange object in the hallway on the floor. It was a woman's handbag, clearly belonging to Nora. It was open, but there was nothing of importance inside. Just her phone, lying unused. Jason dropped to his knees and tried dialing again, but the phone remained dead. "Nora, where are you?" he whispered softly, feeling his heart tighten with pain and despair. Everyone was silent. Jules and even Ron didn't know what to do. Only chaos remained around him. Not understanding anything, Jason decided to take drastic measures. He went outside, trying to find any traces that might point to what happened to his wife. But, besides deep despair and uncertainty, he couldn't find any answers. Every moment seemed like a bigger challenge than the last. Jason stood there, not knowing what to do next. What had happened to his wife? And why had everything become so unclear and dangerous so quickly? An hour after Jason left the house, he entered his home again. The time had been enough for his emotions to settle a little, but his heart was still pounding, and his thoughts left no room for doubt. Something was wrong. He decided to approach the situation head-on, to clear his mind of all the suspicions and fears. But the feeling that his wife Nora was playing some secret game wouldn't let go. What was going on between you two? Jason asked Ron and Jules, who were still sitting on the couch. His voice was firm, but the question made him feel even worse. There was no understanding in their eyes, only surprise. Nothing like that, Jason. We just relaxed, Jules replied, trying to sound calm. She looked at him, but her gaze was evasive. We just talked, that's all, Ron added, raising his hands as if trying to show that nothing serious had happened. His words sounded insincere, and Jason could feel they were trying to hide the truth. He understood they were trying to convince him everything was fine, but how could he believe that after what had happened last night? Just as he was about to say something else, the door opened, and Nora and Mark walked in. They were holding hands, and their behavior was so natural that it completely threw Jason off balance. They looked like a couple in love, and their smiles were too genuine to be normal. Mark and Nora looked very strange for people who had supposedly slept through the entire night. How could this happen? Jason stood there, silently, watching them, unable to say a word. His heart was beating so fast that it felt like it might burst out of his chest. "Where were you?" Jason shouted, but his voice sounded more like despair than anger. He felt betrayed, but he still tried to find an explanation in Nora's eyes. Nora stopped for a moment, but her face showed no shame. She smiled relaxedly and replied, "We just went to the store this morning, Jason. We got held up because we were buying a lot of things we needed for the house, and we just weren't in a hurry. Everything's fine." Jason couldn't believe his ears. How could this be fine? They came in together, holding hands like a couple in love, and they were trying to convince him it was just a coincidence? His heart squeezed, and every move she made, every word seemed like part of a big lie. "And why were you holding hands?" The question escaped his lips, though he tried not to show how shaken he was. "It's just, I was cold," Nora said, trying to sound natural. "You know how sensitive I am to the cold. Nothing special." Mark just smiled and looked at Jason as if the question was truly amusing. But Jason could feel his nerves starting to crack. He saw how their body language changed, how they both tried to hide something. The more he tried to ignore it, the more it seemed unbelievable. Then, Plumber Ron, realizing the atmosphere was beginning to heat up, stood up and said, "Let's not argue. Let's just have some wine and relax," his voice calm, as if trying to defuse the tension in the room. It was too loud to just leave things as they were, but Jason felt he couldn't just calm down. The whole situation seemed too strange, and it got worse when he saw how Nora and Mark were standing together, as if nothing had happened. Hearing those words, Jason felt his anger and disappointment rise to a new level. He didn't want to be among these people now, didn't want to drink wine or have fun when his heart was breaking with worry. Instead of staying and continuing this farce, he decided to leave. "I want to be alone," he said through gritted teeth, no longer trying to suppress his emotions. He walked past them and went to his room. In the room, Jason closed the door and sat on the bed. All these feelings, the chaos that had unfolded in his mind, wouldn't let him be at peace. His suspicions wouldn't leave, and he felt this wasn't the end of it. He had something he could use. Hidden cameras. He had installed them in their old house. He had never told Nora about them, as he didn't want to invade her privacy. But now, he was certain he needed to know the truth, without relying on empty explanations and lies. Jason pressed a button on his phone, and a list of videos appeared on the screen. He knew this could be risky, but he had no other choice. He needed to know the truth, even if it meant reviewing these recordings. At that moment, he decided. He couldn't leave it like this. Now, he had a plan. Jason checked if the hidden cameras were working. They were, and he quietly set them up in various parts of the house, while the guests didn't notice anything. Jason returned to his room. Jason sat in his room, keeping absolute silence, and stared at his phone screen. He could see everything happening in his house through the cameras he had just set up. Those in his house had no idea, and they didn't suspect that Jason was watching them. He watched as the guests continued to have fun. They drank alcohol, danced, laughed, but to him, it all seemed like a suspicious and artificial illusion. No one understood that behind this festive facade, something much darker was happening. Jason went to the kitchen and just stood there, watching as the others had fun. Mark approached him, clearly under the influence of alcohol, and started speaking too loudly, drawing Jason's attention. "Your wife, Nora," he said, tilting his head. She's just amazing. So beautiful, interesting, smart. I don't even understand why you don't appreciate her." Jason heard this and involuntarily felt shock. His anger was growing with his words, but he tried to remain calm, realizing that Mark had no idea how his words were affecting him. "What do you mean?" Jason asked, trying to keep his composure, although his hands were starting to tremble. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had suspected something about Mark and Nora's relationship, but hearing it directly from him was even worse. Mark smiled, sensing he was causing some surprise. "I just think you don't appreciate everything she gives you," Mark said, as if it were obvious. "She's a really strong woman. Understand me right, man. I'm just saying, you need to love her more." Jason felt as if he didn't have the strength to endure anymore. He couldn't hold back and asked, trying not to look too suspicious. "Mark," he began, "was there something between you and Nora last night?" Mark fell silent at first, as if he had stepped out of his thoughts. But when he was about to answer, Nora suddenly approached them. "What are you guys talking about?" she asked, immediately taking Mark's hand. "He's just tired, Jason. Don't pay attention. You know, he needs to rest a bit. Maybe we shouldn't talk about this again." Nora took Mark's hand and led him to the bedroom. Jason was left alone again with the questions that had no answers. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain control over himself. Now he knew what he had to do. Observe, watch every step they made. With a new plan in mind, he opened the app on his phone, connected to the hidden cameras, and began observing. Nora and Mark lay on the bed, and Jason saw this through the bedroom camera. At first, everything was calm, but then something changed. Nora leaned toward Mark, her arms wrapping around his neck, and their lips met in a passionate kiss. Jason couldn't believe what he was seeing. His heart was constricting with pain, and every second on the screen felt like a knife cutting through him. He watched as Nora began betraying him, as Mark gently embraced Nora, and she reciprocated the same. It wasn't just kisses, it was something more. His wife, his one woman, was spending time with another man, right in his home, right before his eyes. Jason felt anger fill his gut, and all his emotions erupted in one instant. But he decided not to confront them directly. His plan was different. He knew he had to act calmly, but very precisely. He needed to keep control and make sure Nora would never forget this. Jason turned off the screen and pushed the phone aside. He could no longer watch, but he was sure he now had everything he needed to start his revenge. His mind was filled with plans, but he didn't want to act on emotions. Now, it was important not to rush. He sat down on the couch, staring into space. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a stab in the back. And although his heart was filled with pain, he understood that now, after everything that had happened, he could no longer remain weak. Jason decided that for now, he should keep it to himself and continue observing. He knew he had time to choose the right moment to respond. Jason woke up early in the morning, his thoughts not yet fully organized after the night he spent watching Nora and Mark. A plan was forming in his head, a plan for revenge. He wouldn't just accept what had happened. His face froze into a grim smile as he realized he had everything to make it painful and unforgettable. Over the next few days, Jason worked on organizing his revenge. He decided not to act hastily. He needed to think through every detail so it wasn't just an emotional outburst, but a true revelation of the truth. He invited Nora, her parents, and their closest friends, including Jules, to a family gathering, which he planned to make the biggest and most painful turning point in their lives. Jason decided that at this stage, he wasn't going to shout, he wasn't going to hit or physically insult Nora. He wanted to do it emotionally, to humiliate her in a way that she would never forget what he had gone through. It would be the revelation of her betrayal at the most painful moment. The preparations for the gathering went quietly, without raising any suspicions. Jason invited all his guests for the day when he would be ready. He knew that to make everything look natural, he couldn't be anxious, and even during the most dramatic moment, he had to remain calm, rational, and sober. On the day of the gathering, everything seemed like nothing had happened. Nora came with all her loved ones, and everyone seemed relaxed, happy, and unsuspecting. Jason greeted the guests with a smile, as usual, and behaved as if everything between him and Nora was fine. They all sat at the table, started talking and laughing, but for Jason, this was just a facade. A few hours later, Jason made it clear to everyone that he had something special to share. He moved to the center of the room, connected his phone to the projector, and a picture appeared on the large screen. A recording from the hidden camera. At first, it was just a scene of everyone celebrating, drinking, laughing, but then the camera switched to the bedroom, and everything changed. The screen showed Nora and Mark kissing, embracing, sharing romantic moments that Jason had been watching for so long from his phone screen. The room froze. All the faces became still, and the silence that followed felt unbearable. Nora sat down, her face turning pale. She tried to say something, but her voice faded. Jason calmly looked at everyone. Not a word escaped his lips. He just looked at Nora, who seemed to be unable to withstand his gaze. And then he started. "This is what you wanted, Nora. You want to live in the illusion that everything is fine, but in reality, you were with him. Is this what you want from me? And you think I wouldn't notice?" Nora tried to justify herself, but her words didn't find an outlet. She tried to explain that it was a mistake, that it didn't matter, that it was just drunken madness. But Jason didn't listen. He looked at her coldly, and it felt like the worst punishment. Her parents, sitting in the corner, silently lowered their gazes, and Jules looked confused, but even she couldn't defend Nora. The situation spiraled out of control, and everyone in the room could feel the tension. Nora started tearfully apologizing, begging him not to do anything foolish, but it no longer mattered. Jason calmly approached her, took her bag, and placed her packed things in front of her. "I think you already understand, Nora, that this is the end. Everything you've done has destroyed everything between us. Our marriage, your betrayals, this is no longer mine. Pack up and leave. I don't make room for people like you in my life." Everyone in the room was silent. No one dared to intervene. It was the moment when everyone felt the full force of what was happening, and Jason's words became the culmination of all the pain he had endured. Nora stood up, her hands trembling, trying to calm herself, but her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't believe that it was all over. But Jason didn't give her the chance to leave the situation behind. He had clearly shown that this wasn't just emotion. It was his decision. "Go," he said again, his voice firm and calm. Nora tried to say something, but all she could do was walk to the door, where her packed things were waiting. Jason didn't look her in the eye. He turned to the other guests and quietly said, "I don't need anyone who lies anymore. I'm leaving everything behind. From now on, I'll live for myself." That was the final word in the story of their marriage. Now Jason was free again. What do you think of Jason's plan? Do you think it was the right thing for him to do? Or could he have found another way to take revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments.